listener production.
Hey, Tara Cassidy with you, and welcome to The Briefing. A virus that's killed 9 Aussies and harmed dozens more has had a resurgence across the country in recent months. But despite its lethal potential, health authorities and those who've experienced its impact firsthand say we're not taking warnings seriously enough.
He was unresponsive and I just panicked and picked him up and I didn't know what to do. He just was having seizures after seizures after seizures. And
what was going on in your mind at that time?
That we were going to lose him.
In today's episode of The Briefing, you'll hear from a mum whose toddler lives with permanent neurological issues after being infected with Japanese Encephalitis Virus, and an expert on the ways we can protect ourselves against JEV, which currently has no cure. That's coming up in the second half of this episode, but first, here's the headlines with Chris Spiru. It's Thursday, the 27th of March.
Morning, Tara. Morning, everybody. Tax cuts are on the way. Labor's budget promise has been passed in the Senate after a late night sitting. The Greens and Crossbench backed the move, but the coalition said no. No surprises there, Tara, with opposition leader Peter Dutton labelling the cuts a tax hoax in recent days. But the cuts are now in. So it'll mean about $270 back in your wallet next year for the average earner and double that the year after. So to reiterate from yesterday when we first heard about this policy in the budget on Tuesday night, that is $5 a week back in your pockets from next year and $10 the year after.
And the LNP's come out saying that they're hoping to offer up a better way forward in its budget reply speech tonight, instead offering up a different cost of living solution by slashing our fuel prices if elected. The LNP wants to cut the fuel excise by 25 cents for a year, bringing the rate from about 50 cents to 25 cents a litre. Now, that fuel excise cut would amount to about $14 a week back in the pocket for a 55-litre car, which is about $700 a year. So it's a little bit more than the $5 to $10 a week tax cuts from Labor, but not a huge amount of difference. Labor did say that their tax cuts are meant to be added to previous ones, though, which would amount to about $50 a week overall. So make of that what you will.
Yeah, I mean, for me, like I mentioned, this was first announced in the budget. This was their big surprise, key thing that they wanted to surprise us all with come Wednesday morning when most of us are kind of poring over the budget findings and reports and coverage. Essentially what they've done here, and purposefully so, they've kind of backed the Libs into a corner and said, well, now you're voting against tax cuts for the everyday Australian, and that's not a good look heading into an election. What I will say is the tax cut that they're voting against is so marginal. Like we said yesterday, like a lot of people have come out to say yesterday, it is so teeny tiny. And for me, I'm really struggling to wrap my head around how something that eventually is going to give us $10 back in our pocket is costing the government $17 billion. I mean, I can think of at least 5 things off the top of my head I'd rather that money go towards, homelessness and feeding programs being just one of them, Tara.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think both of them, it takes a massive chunk out of the budget for the government, so it feels to them as though it's a massive gesture. But in terms of what's actually being felt by the everyday Aussie, $5, $10, $14 between both, is it enough that people are actually going to notice? Is it actually going to provide that cost of living relief that we're looking for, either of these plans? I don't know.
Yeah, and look, to Labor's point, which we kind of already spoke about, it's part of a wave of measures, and those measures are good. You know, the savings in Medicare, the savings on the PBS and things like that, those are great. Look, I do want to touch on something that happened in Parliament yesterday. Obviously, the Prime Minister spoke in the House of Representatives and he came out to attack the coalition for not wanting to back these tax cuts. Here's what he had to say.
They are delulu with no salulu, Mr. Speaker. They are completely delusional.
Delulu with no salulu. But there's a little story to this one, isn't there, Chris?
Yeah, and again, this is on the back end of something that we were talking about yesterday. Last week, the Prime Minister sat down to do a podcast with Lucy and Nikki. They're fellow listener stablemates of ours. And this is just a little chunk of their conversation that I'm going to play out for you now.
Delulu. Can use it in a sentence. I must be delulu, but I feel like he was giving me the eyes.
Delusional.
Perfect.
Boom.
Yep.
Like
Okay, next one.
Peter Dutton on nuclear power costs. Delulu.
I dare you to drop that in the speech.
Do you reckon I can do that?
Delulu with no salulu.
We've got budget week next week. Listen up. Be a little in-joke between the three of us and all of your
And the punters.
crew.
The three of us and the punters.
So there you have it. If anyone's doubtful that Anthony Albanese can deliver on pre-election promises, hey, here you go. Here's a little bit of something to bolster your faith and supporting the man, I guess.
Now, while we found out last week that Coles and Woolies are among the most profitable supermarkets in the world, we've also just found out who's charging us the most.
Ooh.
Any guesses, Chris?
Oh, it's got to be Aldi, Tara. Definitely Aldi.
Oh, it's not Aldi. Trusty Aldi. No, it is, unsurprisingly, it is Woolies.
Yeah.
Consumer advocacy group Choice compared the big three supermarkets and found Woolies was the most pricey from March to December last year when compared against Coles and Aldi. Coles was very close behind, mind you, less than $1 difference for a whole basket of groceries. Aldi in third, where shoppers would pay about $17 less a basket, so not insignificant.
Yeah, I mean, that's about $880 a year in savings if you're shopping there weekly, which is huge, Tara. The price tracker report found that Woolies prices had increased over the course of the year, while Coles started off as the most expensive, having dropped slightly by the last quarter. Trusty old Aldi staying very much the same, a difference of about 30 cents over that same period.
Now, that's just, though, from a comparison of the three big supermarkets, like we said. Choice did actually start looking at IGA stores as well, but only from mid-year, so not enough data to fairly compare it to the others. But just from June to December, they were actually by far the most expensive of all the stores, nearly $79 for a basket of groceries at IGA mid last year, and still nearly $75 by December. And one thing worth mentioning about Coles and Woolies, I remember reading an article once where their prices were analysed over a 4-month period of a few staple grocery items. And it found essentially that they go in this cycle, the two rotate in, where, say, a bottle of soft drink, for example, one week if Woolies is charging $4, Coles will charge $2. Then the next week they would swap up and down, week to week. And that was found across a number of items. So really, what does it say? I think Aldi's the way to go.
Returning to politics for a moment, new laws have passed in Parliament overnight, which critics say water down environmental protections and blatantly favour Tasmania's salmon farming industry, despite its impact on a threatened species.
On the eve of the election, have you sold out your environment credentials for a rotten, stinking extinction salmon? Extinction salmon.
Remove the prop from the chamber.
Yeah, now that was footage that swirled around yesterday. That was Greens Environment spokesperson Senator Sarah Hanson-Young there, pulling out a massive salmon in Senate yesterday. Now look, Tara, I love nothing more than when a politician brings a prop into Parliament. This for me reminded me the most of when Scott Morrison did this back in 2017.
This is coal. Don't be afraid. Don't be scared.
The Treasurer knows the rule on props.
It's coal.
But look, I do want to talk about this particular issue. This is by no means a new issue or even trivial, to be honest. You might have heard Jackie Lambie also weighing in on it from time to time.
Dirty, stinking salmon.
Now, where the criticism kicks in this area is that several environmental groups, even conservative ones, have come out to say that the salmon industry is harming a threatened species mostly found in Tassie waters, and that's the Magean skate. So it looks like a stingray minus the stinger. The state government denies that, while the PM has previously described this debate as a balance between industry and conservation. So where they've landed with coalition support overnight is essentially in favour of that industry.
As to what we know about salmon farming, it is $1 billion industry. It contributes $770 million a year to the state's economy, and according to industry reports, it's a major employer, employing around 90% of regional Tasmanians, apparently. But according to Lambie, 60% of Tasmanians don't want it in the state, arguing if it needs to exist, it should be pushed further offshore and away from endangered species. But before the laws had passed, it had also attracted the attention of Hollywood star Leonardo DiCaprio, who called on his 60.5 million Instagram followers to help save the Magean skate and prevent the extinction of this unique species. Now, given environmental protections were a central focus of the Albanese government in the lead up to the 22 election, no doubt this will continue to bubble away today and over the next few weeks. To New South Wales now, where around 9,000 court documents have been exposed in a major data breach. Police say it was discovered on Tuesday that sensitive files had been downloaded from the state's online court registry with documents like apprehended violence orders or AVOs and affidavits among those stolen. The portal, which is overseen by the Department of Community and Justice, contains information about both civil and criminal cases right across the New South Wales court system. The state's cybercrime squad is now investigating and the full extent of the breach is not yet known.
Yeah, and just on this, it's terrifying that AVOs, which are such a deeply personal thing, those are such deeply personal documents, are, among those that have been exposed and kind of quote-unquote leaked. Affidavits too, that's not something to be looking at lightly. Affidavits contain a lot of personal information. It contains medical records, it contains psychiatric records, it contains a lot of personal information people would not want out there.
No, and depending on what kind of criminal cases we're talking about, like this could be rape victims, this could be, children, like you mentioned, mental health reports, things like that, like very sensitive information that people do not want out there. Definitely really frightening. And just another example, I think, of these kind of big organisations where people feel safe that their information is going to be protected, and all of a sudden we're just seeing yet another breach.
And changing pace, the cast or voices behind our beloved homegrown kid show Bluey have reacted to the fact that some episodes have been censored in the US. So, a number of episodes have been banned in the States after being dubbed not suitable for younger audiences. The reasons, though, had a few scratching their heads because some scenes involve, quote, bodily functions. Tara, what that means is in one episode of Bluey, his dad and sister are playing in a paddling pool and they mimic giving birth.
I didn't know this was the something. I got a foot. Oh, I can see the butt.
Keep pushing.
Oh my gosh. I mean, and then there's some other eps that haven't aired because they involve vomiting or, quote, passing gas. And Melanie Zanetti, who's the voice of Bluey's mum, Chili, she's come out saying she just finds this wild. She said the amount of things that are acceptable in America, but a fart-focused episode was not. And I completely agree. I think that's hilarious. And as you listen to that, even just with the grab, you can hear like it's a kid's cartoon. They're not talking about anything, particularly graphic or suggestive. It's pretty wild.
Yeah, and I mean, as someone who hasn't sat through a whole episode of Bluey, because I feel, I'm too old for Bluey. I'm happy to say that, and I'm not in that nexus of like having kids or like nephews and nieces around me that want to watch Bluey. We're really much on the Wiggles train at the moment with the nephews and nieces around me.
Best days are ahead then still, Chris.
I really, really hope so.
No one is ever too old for Bluey. Now, that wraps up our headlines for today. Next is my deep dive looking into Japanese Encephalitis Virus, which is back circulating Australia. Imagine almost losing your child to a virus that people online say doesn't even exist. Well, that's exactly what happened to mum Beck Gilliland back in 2021 during an Australian outbreak of Japanese Encephalitis virus. Her 4-month-old baby boy Sam was one of nearly 50 people that got infected before about 125,000 doses of the JEV vaccine was given to Aussies. After that, many of us thought we were in the clear, with no more human cases popping up. That was until late last year. Since then, the virus has been detected in every state and territory in Australia. 9 people have been infected so far, and 2 people have died, with back-to-back wet weather events fueling mozzie numbers and helping JEV spread. This time round, though, a lack of uptake in the vaccine and even some scepticism online is concerning health authorities and those who've experienced the virus firsthand, like Beck, whose son was infected during a family camping trip. Fast forward a few years and Sam, who's now a toddler, lives with permanent damage to his nervous system and a lifelong reminder of just how serious JEV can be. Beck, thank you so much for joining me on the briefing. Can you start by taking me back to when this first unfolded? What happened?
Going back 3 years ago, it was Valentine's Day. I think it was about 10 o'clock at night, and Sam had been sort of clingy all day. He was in our bed, and all of a sudden I happened to turn the light on, and he was just staring at the fan that was going around, and I just immediately knew something was up, and I said to Luke, there's something not right, and he was unresponsive, and I just panicked and picked him up, and I didn't know what to do. He just was having seizures after seizures after seizures, and Luke called the ambulance, and we ended up in the children's and for a horrible 2 weeks.
What was going on in your mind at that time?
That we were going to lose him. We were sent straight to the children's, and we were lucky enough to have Dr. Julian Kelly on call, he's been fantastic. But straight away they did a lumbar puncture, took him for tests, and they were on alert. But at that stage they thought maybe meningitis. So they were treating him for that. Because he was so little, his veins just weren't big enough to cope with the lines that they were putting in him for the meds. So then he had to go under and have a PICC line put in his neck too. So with all the constant seizures, he was in intensive care. I think it was 3 nights that were in intensive care just because they couldn't stabilise the seizures. But everything that they were doing was just trial and error because they couldn't really find at that stage what it was. The test that they'd done on the Sunday, just in case it was JEV, had returned positive. So everything they'd done was the meds he had was all really not needed because there was no cure for it anyway. So it was a very trying time in those 2 weeks. He was very weak. He just laid there in that hospital cot and basically didn't move. So, it was pretty horrible.
And besides those initial things you mentioned at the start, that he was convulsing and having seizures, and you mentioned just now that he was quite weak, were there any other physical repercussions from him getting JEV?
At that time, because he was only 4 months, it was he just started to roll and babble, but then after this occurrence, he wasn't doing any of that, and it took him a long time then to start rolling, and he was behind developmentally. But then you fast forward to today, and he's nearly 3.5, and he only has a handful of words. So, it has had major effects on his speech. People start to talk to him and he doesn't talk back, and, he can't even say his name at 3.5. So that's the main thing that's sort of been lingering at the moment.
Have the doctors given you any insight into what the future might look like for Sam?
No one knows. No idea, and that's the most frustrating thing. They're flying off the seat of their pants as well because there's never been another case of a child having it either. There's only been adults. So they were referring to journals from India when he sort of at the start, but I mean, each case is also different.
And given what you guys have been through, how have you felt seeing more and more cases of JEV and hearing about the virus popping up across Australia of late?
It's frustrating when you look on social media and you see, people's posts and then all the news posts and trolls out there or whoever they may be bagging it out and saying that it's a made-up illness and, here we go again, another fake news. But it's not fake, it's real. I know that there is a guy in Melbourne at the moment and he's been in intensive care for quite some time.
What would you say to people who aren't taking it seriously?
They can think what they want, but it is real. Absolutely get vaccinated because it's something could save your life. There has been a couple of older guys that have died from it in the last couple of years. So Sam could have died if we hadn't have got help or the ambulance had have come as fast as it did. So we are just very lucky, and if it's a speech that's affected, he's still here. So At the end of the day, vaccinations are there. They're there for a reason, and you've just got to beware when you go camping and, make sure you cover up and put on the mozzie repellent. But in saying that, we didn't see a single bite on Sam, so we had no idea until the results come back.
While there isn't currently a cure for Japanese Encephalitis virus, one of the people that's working in the medical space that's trying to change that and aiming to develop stronger vaccines for future strains is Dr. Daniel Rawl. He's the head of the Emerging Viral Diseases Lab at the QIMR Berghofer Medical Research Institute, which spent several years studying JEV. He says the virus first started circulating in certain animals before being transmitted to humans and since being declared endemic.
Japanese encephalitis virus is a mosquito-borne virus. It's maintained in the environment through a cycle between wading birds and pigs and mosquitoes. So the mosquito can bite an infected animal, the mosquito will then become infected, and then it can go and bite a human, which means then the human can become infected. The mosquito can't uptake the virus from infected humans because the level of virus is too low in the humans.
Can you talk me through what the impacts are for humans who might contract JEV? What are their symptoms and what does the most severe end of this look like?
Most people who get bitten by an infected mosquito will not have symptoms. So 99+% of the time, people won't know they're infected. About 1 in 250 will develop symptoms, and this is usually when the virus enters the brain. So the first symptom to look out for is fever. That just means you've become infected with a virus and your body's trying to fight the virus off. If it gets into the brain and infects the neurons in the brain, the more severe symptoms to look out for will be headache, neck stiffness, vomiting, seizures, coma, paralysis, anything neurological related. A third of the time of people with severe symptoms unfortunately go on to die. A third of the time people have prolonged or permanent neurological damage, and the other third of the people can go on to fully recover.
And we have seen a number of those cases in recent months end up being fatalities. Since those, what has been the discussion in the medical space?
Yeah, so we've had this season so far 2 fatalities. There's another case in Victoria who he's been in ICU since last year. So he's an example of very severe disease with prolonged disease. The discussion at the moment in Brisbane, after having this detection in mosquitoes identified in Brisbane City for the first time, is whether we extend the free vaccine program to residents of Brisbane. So across the country, people who are deemed at high risk, largely due to either where they live, work, or whether they work in high-risk industries such as pig farmers, abattoir workers, or laboratory scientists, are able to access the vaccine for free.
And if you become infected, is there a treatment?
There's no specific treatment at the moment for Japanese encephalitis, unfortunately. It's really difficult to treat because once it's in the brain, you need to have treatments that can also get through the blood-brain barrier for it to be effective. So there's sort of 2 options that we're investigating. There's an antiviral, so to reduce the amount of virus you have, or an anti-inflammatory to reduce that hyperactive encephalitis, which is the inflammation of the brain. But it's really difficult because you need to, if you go down the road of an anti-inflammatory, you need to make sure that you're not hampering your natural antiviral responses. Otherwise, you can end up with your virus lasting longer in the brain. So there's no treatment available apart from supportive care, which is your standard ICU care, ventilation and fluids and so on.
Is this the kind of virus that can mutate and therefore the vaccine needs to be continually updated as well?
All viruses can mutate. JV, it's not mutating as quickly as viruses like SARS-CoV-2, for example, which we know new variants are emerging all the time, which are being able to escape vaccine responses, and they're updating the vaccines more regularly. For JV, we do see that the vaccine responses are suboptimal against current circulating strains, but we know that they still work. We know that they're still detectable. The vaccine is still recognising the currently circulating strain in Australia. But we think if we update the vaccine, we can make those antibody responses more optimal. But we're not going to be in the situation as we are with COVID, where we have really rapid mutation and vaccine escape.
How big of a threat would you describe this disease as?
It is a threat, and it seems to be a growing threat in Australia. It's a very serious illness that you do not want, and we know it can be fatal. So most of the Australian population is naive to this virus, which means they haven't received the vaccination or they haven't been infected by the virus yet. So there is a threat that we will see more cases, and that's not something that anybody wants.
And so moving forward, is this something where there needs to be more of a focus from government bodies intervening? Do we need more funding or awareness campaigns? What do we need in this space?
Yeah, so in general, more funding into research to come up with new strategies for treatment, I think, is important, because once you're infected, there's really nothing that can be specifically done to be able to treat people. So I think coming up with new treatments is important. Mosquito surveillance is important, as we've seen now with this detection of the virus in Brisbane through routine council surveillance. That's a really important tool to be able to help us find out where the virus is, its risk of exposure to humans, and that help guides public policy, such as mosquito control programs, such as vaccination programs. So I think all levels of government working together in as many ways as they can in research funding, mosquito control, vaccination programs and so on will be really important going forward to help reduce the threat that JEV poses.
That was viral diseases expert Dr. Daniel Raw with me there. Before him, Mum Beck Gilliland. Both making a pretty good argument for getting the JEV vaccine, being the only effective protection we have at the moment until medicos can find a cure. That's all for today's episode of The Briefing. If you know someone who might find this ep interesting, we'd love it if you could share it with them and or our social posts. You can check us out on Instagram at The Briefing Podcast and on TikTok and YouTube, search Listener Newsroom. I'm Tara Cassidy. See you next time.
Listener.